him and I guess Nokia, they've not really wanted to get involved in these geopolitical discussions. I think they'd rather just talk about the technology and the business, and so it's an awkward question for them. But they've been, Ericsson's been very, very quiet while the US has been sort of running around urging bans on Huawei, and didn't, as far as I'm aware, have very much to say at all when the UK moved to introduce its ban, or when France did similar things, or when Australia said we're not having any Huawei in our 5G network a couple of years ago. Didn't have a lot to say. I mean, clearly it's massively in Ericsson's interest to have no Huawei in these markets, because it's a huge opportunity for it to come in and replace the company. And at a time when there's not a lot of growth left in the market, that's the only way in their main addressable market they're going to boost revenue. So
hello and welcome to the first Telecoms.com podcast of 2021. As you will notice, we're not in the studio. We valiantly went into the studio. I think half the time we came in, we weren't even supposed to, because the office was closed and they were saying work from home if you can. But yeah, well, it's all right. We've done it now. But we did, because we're that committed. But this time we're on lockdown level 400. Everything's closed. I couldn't come in anyway because I only got back from the Canary Islands on the 3rd of January, and I've got to be on quarantine till the 14th.
Oh, God.
But even when my quarantine's over, I've got a feeling we're going to be doing these for a little while. I mean, they reckon this super duper lockdown's probably going to be a couple of months, don't they?
Yeah. They said until March. They said mid-February now. It's maybe until March.
I think mid-February is the goal for vaccinating everybody who's over 70.
Well, I'll tell you what,
it takes 2 or 3 weeks to take effect. So
before we get stuck into that, because I quite fancy chatting about a few sort of current affairs-y things. But Pierre, who's the only grown-up in the room, insists that I talk about telecom stuff first, so that people don't tune in and just go, what's this? I could listen to any people moaning about the news. So I think he does have a point, to be fair. So I'll concede that point, but I'm still going to we'll still get to scratch that current affairs itch at the end, Ian.
Yeah.
So, so there's that. So what we are going to talk about, we're going to start off by talking about the good old US versus China stuff. Been a few bits of news at the start of the year, a few developments on that front. Then we're going to move into sort of UK thing. There's a story today, pretty much, I think, about how we're not doing very well at rolling out fibre, which surprises nobody. And then we're going to finish off with moaning. Maybe you can call it moaning on the captions, Pierre.
Yeah. Scott's moaning.
Ian will moan. Don't you worry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, so just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Now, Pierre, before we get stuck in, did you have some producer stuff?
The shout out of the city of the month, which is Brugge or Bruges in Belgium. And a close second is Fresno in California. I have a feeling Fresno is like people who used to live in San Jose but moved out to a cheaper place. It's probably that.
I wonder why they listen to us in Bruges.
Yeah, Bruges is an odd one. It's not exactly a tech hub, is it?
Have you ever seen the film In Bruges?
I have.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's good, isn't it? I quite like it.
Yeah, it's
the
good.
jump still haunts me to this day. Oof.
Oh, yeah. And it's also where Dr. Evil was raised. Dr. Evil from the Austin Powers films is raised in Bruges. And that's where they made him so frickin' evil.
Ralph Fiennes or Rafe Fiennes or whatever being particularly good in Bruges.
Yeah, it's a baddie.
You're an animate object.
Doing his Cockney acts is brilliant.
Yeah. No, he's quality, that bloke. Okay, well, thanks, Bruges, and thanks, Fresno. I can't think of anything quirky or fun to say about Fresno.
There's probably a song with Fresno in it.
Some sort of 60s, sort of Beach Boys song or something. And get Fresno to go on a beach and chill out and get a tan.
Fresno is inland, though.
These days, it's just full of people from Facebook, I suspect.
Okay, right. So yeah, the China stuff. There's a few things that I think we're going to stitch together. I'm going to start with just pure US-China aggro. The sort of funny one at the start of the week was this thing about the New York Stock Exchange delisting China Mobile, China Telecom, China Unicom. And they were going to delist them because one of Trump's many executive orders, basically what he's been doing is coming up with these executive orders, each of which incrementally say no one in the US can do any business with anyone in China. But you can't just come out and say it and just like, we're cutting China off, we're building a wall in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's that. Although that would be an impressive achievement, even for the supposed wall builder, Trump. He had to just cut off little bits, all these little digs at Huawei, and then they can't buy chips and all that sort of thing. And his latest one is that that these Chinese telcos can't be listed on New York Stock Exchange because then they're getting American money to support Chinese nefarious stuff. It's so tenuous. Anyway, so on top of that being tenuous, they sort of went, yeah, all right, then we better delist them. And then someone else had a little word going, nah, don't worry about it. Maybe it was someone from the incoming Biden administration. So then they came out with another announcement the day later. So the first announcement was like New Year's Eve, I think. Second announcement was last Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, they went, oh, someone else has had a word. And now we are delisting them again. It's completely farcical. And to be honest, I think the New York Stock Exchange only deserves a relatively small amount of the blame because they're clearly just being buffeted by all this political dicking about. Was that your take on it, Ian?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the chances are of them getting listed again.
Yeah. Once Biden's properly in place.
Yeah, we've obviously got a change in administration coming, and it seems very much as though, I mean, I imagine this normally happens, but there's a rush to get through bits of legislation that the sort of to-do list suddenly become more urgent in those last few weeks. Especially if you've perhaps thought that you weren't going to be leaving the White House anyway, as this guy did. So you kind of wonder when Biden does get in, what does change. And there's been a lot of speculation anyway about his China policy and what he's going to do, I suppose, as regards Huawei and ZTE and the other companies that we've been talking about for years now. So it's just it's really bizarre, but
it's just sort of metastasizing. So
it's an odd one. The financial side of it's a bit weird, in a way. I think this delisting and because you start to think, if they're going to that extent, then there's the whole issue of intellectual property and the fact that companies, like Huawei and Ericsson, Cisco, sit together in a lot of the same forums, and there's collaboration that goes on between them. So, if we don't want China Telecom and China Unicom listed on the NYSE, then do we start to think about some of these standards bodies? Is that going too far as some of the US hawks are concerned? And what other companies don't we want on the stock exchange as well? Because there's obviously
quite.
There's big Russian companies that raise capital in that way. So
no one's ever banned them, even when at the height of the Cold War.
Exactly.
Although maybe they did, I don't know.
I don't know about them, but some companies like Vion, for instance, which is headquartered in Amsterdam, but is basically a
properly Russian,
mainly Russian operator. Most of its revenues are in that market. They're listed on the NYSE,
and even more broadly than that, there is the issue. And Phil, your editor, commented on one of my stories, and I've chatted to him subsequently. There's the issue of the US government poking its nose into what private companies get up to and telling them who they can do business with. Now, not only is that dodgy full stop, but it's also completely hypocritical, because the main problem the US and its allies have with Huawei is that they feel it's beholden to the Chinese state. And then the way they're acting against it is to make US companies beholden to the US state by putting these increasing regulations, telling them what to do. So it's completely bloody hypocritical. It's more of that, if you can't beat them, join them. And I think they sacrifice all their moral high ground when they do that.
Well, even with suggestions which have come out in the past about, the US government maybe taking a majority stake in Ericsson or Nokia, or pumping huge amounts of money into new technology like ORAN. how can one of the criticisms be about state aid and unfair Chinese government involvement when they're proposing things like that? It's just it's so ludicrous. It really is.
It is, and it's not like the US is saying they don't spy on China. It's not like anyone's saying they don't spy on everything they can get a chance. You remember there was that time a few years ago when some bug was found in Angela Merkel's soup or something like that.
Yeah.
Everyone's spying on each other. It's just what you do. And every now and then you get caught and they have to sort of go, oh, it was a rogue agent and whatever the standard bullshit is. So it's increasingly hard to prize them apart. I mean, that's notwithstanding some of the extra sinister stuff that the Chinese get up to.
I always think that
like Hong Kong and Xinjiang and all that sort of thing.
Well, I always think that's the way to pursue this campaign, in my opinion, really. I've always found the security one and the spying one is always a bit, and I know that's the reason that a lot of European governments perhaps have now moved to restrict Huawei or say that, they can't have Chinese equipment in their networks in the future. But for me, it should really, in a way, I think it should be less about security and more about ethics in a way, I suppose. Do we really want to be, at a time when the Chinese government is becoming a lot more aggressive and we see what's happening in Hong Kong, do we really want to be spending money, especially given all the accusations? Now, I know there's never been a smoking gun, but there have been court cases, dating back to 2003 about intellectual property theft.
Yeah.
There have been numerous allegations about, Iran. Obviously, we've got that whole affair going on. There's been the suggestion that they receive, all this money from the Chinese government and therefore they're able to compete unfairly. I almost think those are better ways of pressing the case than this whole security issue, which, as you say, everybody kind of does that anyway.
Yeah.
And the US has already been shown to be doing it quite recently with its allies, with the whole Angela Merkel thing and Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
So,
the only problem with the ethics angle, there was a little bit of outcry recently, like immediately after the Brexit thing finally got done and dusted. Europe signed some big trade deal with China, and lots of people on my side of the fence, i.e., the people who were pro Brexit, were suddenly huffing and puffing that Europe does this. And I was thinking, well, two things. Firstly, the whole point of Brexit was for us to have the autonomy to sign deals with whoever we want. So who the hell are we doing moralizing about what Europe does anymore?
Yeah, no, I didn't mean ethics in that way, perhaps. I meant more...
No, but let me finish. The point I'm making is that I think ethics in a geopolitical way are quite hard to pin down. We do business with all sorts of dodgy places, ethically, like Saudi Arabia, for example. And so I just think it's a hard hill to die on in terms of geopolitics to talk about ethics because it's just so slippery, that's all.
It is, but there's some egregious cases, aren't there? I mean, the Saudi Arabia one, I mean, we wouldn't have been buying munitions off Germany in the 1930s, would we?
I guess not. And Saudi Arabia goes and chops up a journalist, and it doesn't sort of really do anything,
it does,
does it?
But I guess the Saudi Arabia and China on the world stage, and in terms of the threat they pose to the world order, I think are very different things.
So I agree. So it's a sort of combination of considerations.
But I think that ethics is the wrong word for it. Maybe I just think maybe on the sort of fair competition grounds. The fact that Western companies can't get a fair shot in China. Why should we give them a fair shot over here? If they don't want to play by WTO rules, if Ericsson can only get 10% of the Chinese telecom market and Nokia can't get anything at all, mobile infrastructure, I mean, then why should we allow them to? Yeah,
no, I've got no argument with you. And this Cold War, if indeed it is a Cold War, is distinctive in that China is a far greater economic power than Russia and the Eastern Bloc, even the whole Eastern Bloc were. So this Cold War is bound to be far more characterized by trade and commercial matters, whereas the previous one was more proper, like sort of espionage and arms race and all that sort of thing. Also, China seems to have very limited, like, geographical expansionist ambitions. short of like Taiwan and Hong Kong and that sort of thing.
It has up to now, but
you never know.
It's certainly been notably more aggressive in the areas where it does sort of see sort of geographical expansion opportunity, if you like, than it ever has been in the past 10, 15 years. I think it's the stuff that's going on in Hong Kong at the moment, the stuff that's going on the Indian border, the stuff that's going on in the South China Sea. From what you read anyway in newspapers, it sounds like it's really sort of ramped up in the last sort of 2-3 years. So it's
that is another point. If we start thinking about hot war, which we've never really thought about proper war involving superpowers, except for like superpowers steaming into somewhere small in a usually doomed attempt to sort them out. But we haven't thought about superpower versus superpower war almost since the Second World War. And I suppose this is a bit of a tangent, and I'll get it back onto vaguely telecoms-y stuff in a sec. But China is flanked by Russia at the north, India at the southwest, Indonesia and Australasia at the southeast. So I guess its potential for just going and invading places is relatively small. Not that it's shown any inclination.
Yeah.
But then what if it steams into Taiwan? Then that's just going to kick right off.
Well, that will be the flashpoint, because there'd be an expectation then. I mean, the US has always had this sort of commitment to, I think it's always had this commitment anyway to kind of defend Taiwan, hasn't it?
Taiwan's the Belgium of this era.
Exactly. It's the, if they failed to do anything, then it would sort of be a massive climb down in their position. And it would be like not responding to an attack on a NATO country, wouldn't it, really?
Yeah, I think so.
So
that's all a bit tasty. Steering it back onto on the sort of tech sector, telecoms-y stuff. The other one, in fact, this was our most read story of the week, was one I wrote saying US follows India's lead in banning Chinese mobile payment apps. So India's been banning Chinese apps. It's banned like hundreds of them so far. And now the US, again, this is I think a Trump executive order thing. They're banning, like two of the big ones are Alipay, which is Alibaba's payment one, and WePay, which is the payment aspect of WeChat, which is owned by Tencent, which are pretty much the two biggest Chinese companies to the best of my knowledge. So that's just yet another front. And I mean, I'd need to click on the story and remind myself why, but I seem to remember the rationale again was quite tenuous. It was like, well, they might get some data. If Americans use it, they might get some data on them, and that might be used for spying or something like that. It's just really weak justifications. But then again, they could argue that loads of like US apps are banned in China, so they could argue they're just catching up, couldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what does happen when Biden takes over, actually, in terms of things like this, because I suspect not all that much will change in terms of, the big companies like Huawei and the kind of campaign that's happened there. It's not as though Biden coming in is really going to change the story for Huawei.
No, it would be politically awkward for him to suddenly reverse course, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would, and it would be politically awkward for, I mean, the UK, there's long been the suspicion that they just basically caved in eventually to US pressure to impose a full ban, right?
That was certainly our impression, wasn't it?
Yeah, they tried to do this 35%, limit, and then they kind of got hassled a bit more, and eventually went, oh, okay, then let's just ban them entirely. Now you've got a change in administration happening, and I think Huawei seemed to have got its hopes up last year that, maybe Biden coming in would be a way for them to get back into the UK, and I don't see any chance of that happening at all, really, and I don't think Biden's necessarily going to be very soft on them. I just think I think this sort of tit for tat stuff that's going on, the kind of banning of fairly small apps and the NYC SE stuff. And I think maybe that will stop happening, and he'll try and do things in a slightly more conciliatory way, I guess. Maybe
or a more behind the scenes.
More behind the scenes and old school, trying to sort of build alliance with other countries rather than, or if you don't do what we're telling you, then we're not going to sell you any planes next year kind of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think now that Trump is officially out of it, and I think we may well touch on some of the drama this week later on in the in the sort of any other business section, that his, to some extent, there's a sort of full stop on his legacy. There's like a clean break. I still think it's fair to look back on his period, eccentric, bizarre, unique though it was. I think the China stuff, I can't imagine any regular politician sort of changing the trajectory with respect to China in the way that he did. I mean, it's very hit and miss. There's lots of random stuff, lots of very counterproductive stuff. But I think the softly approach just plays straight into their strength. And I'm talking specifically about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, not China on the whole, but their political strength, which is just to do stuff on the sly, to say, yeah, we'll do that, and then do something different. They just sort of play everyone. And I think it took someone as brutish as Trump to sort of shake things up a bit.
Maybe he's done maybe history will remember him a bit differently, because he's kind of done a favor, for his successors in a way, because he's, they're probably not going to go about things in the same way that he does.
Yeah,
they'll be more diplomatic, but at the same time, he's created, because he's changed the conversation so much, it gives them an opportunity to kind of come in and be reasonably tough. He's already been. Now is an improvement on what he's done as far as China's concerned. Yeah, if it's looking for someone to negotiate with and talk to, and maybe some kind of opportunity, then anything's an improvement almost.
Yeah, but he's changed the trajectory.
I think
for that we should be grateful.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one area. I mean, his legacy is going to be very mixed. I think, he's not. The economy's done pretty well under him. He's not taken the world into war, which I think a lot of his critics expected him to do.
Yes, and he's turned out not to be a fascist.
For God's
sake.
I think polarization has got worse during his presidency. Not just because of him, but he's certainly not helped that. He's been a part of that, and that's a very sad thing, I think, because that's probably the worst thing there is at the moment in US politics, is this inability to kind of find any middle ground at all.
Or just offer even a single conciliatory syllable to each other.
Well, and it's not even just politicians, it's just ordinary people. I mean, people that you and I know that we're not going to mention now. I tend to you talk to Americans, they're all very much sort of one way or the other. There's not a lot of nuance. They've very much kind of picked a side, And you do see that okay as well these days, actually. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in other parts.
Well, look,
in the US.
Mate, you're talking to someone who's openly admitted to voting Leave for the past 4 years. I know all about polarisation.
And that's the best example of it in the UK, obviously, is the whole Brexit debate, which has been massively polarising and has been a classic example of people not able to see the other side of the argument at all, most people. But it just seems to be so much worse in the US, and I think that's got worse under him. And so I guess he's going to be bringing it back to telecom. And I think on the China thing, I think it's actually good, because I personally think something probably did need to be done about China. And if we're trying to look at it from an industry perspective, the last 10, 12, 15 years, whatever it's been, that Huawei has slowly been rising up the agenda and has become this sort of all-powerful thing and a very dominant force in the industry. That's not been good. That's not a healthy state of affairs for the industry to have this super powerful vendor, which is, let's be honest, the fact that it's come along and been so price competitive and whatever has allowed it to do that's generated a huge amount of consolidation in the industry. We're now in this situation where operators are complaining about not having choice. We've got a desire to try and get new technologies out quickly. It's not the most healthy environment. So
no,
I think it needed looking at, and it fits into this kind of China narrative. And so I think his legacy in that area is probably more positive than perhaps the other.
So there's another side to that coin, which is Western companies that want to do business in China and not fall foul of collateral damage from all this tit for tat bullshit that's flying around. So I'll hand it over to you. We've both written about this, but I know you wrote a more sort of opinion-driven piece on Boye Ekholm, the CEO of Ericsson, continues to berate his own country, Sweden, for banning Huawei. So why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's him and I guess Nokia, they've not really wanted to get involved in these geopolitical discussions. I think they'd rather just talk about the technology and the business, and so it's an awkward question for them. But they've been, Ericsson's been very, very quiet while the US has been sort of running around urging bans on Huawei, and didn't, as far as I'm aware, have very much to say at all when the UK moved to introduce its ban, or when France did similar things, or when Australia said we're not having any Huawei in our 5G network a couple of years ago. Didn't have a lot to say. I mean, clearly it's massively in Ericsson's interest to have no Huawei in these markets, because it's a huge opportunity for it to come in and replace the company. And at a time when there's not a lot of growth left in the market, that's the only way in their main addressable market they're going to boost revenues. So, but all of a sudden, Sweden says it's going to do the same thing. Anybody who wins a 5G license can't use Huawei to build the network. And all of a sudden, Boy Erkom's putting his hand up. Oh no, we don't want this. This is not fair. This is not what free trade and global fairness is all about.
Yeah, it's like, hold on. How come you're suddenly so worried about that?
How are you so worried about? I mean, it's quite.
I think you made a point in your piece about how he wasn't piping up when it was happening in Australia.
Well, exactly, and he's put himself in a little bit of an awkward situation, I think, because the trouble is that anybody now, could sit down with him and say, well, hang on a minute, if this is how strongly you feel about the Swedish situation, then are you going to start lobbying the UK government to overturn the Huawei ban? And if not, not. And the reality is they're not going to say it, but they're desperately worried about what happens to their China business. As a Swedish company, they are obviously at risk of any Chinese retaliation against Sweden. And they don't have a massive market share in China, but because it's such a massive market, even with their 10 or 11% or whatever it is, you've got a country that I think it built about 700,000 5G base stations last year. There's something like 600,000 planned this year. You look at I dug into their results again because I couldn't remember, but I dug into them this week. That China market grew, I think, in the third quarter, which is the last one they've reported for, by about 40%.
It was like nearly all there.
It's all the growth, and it's a huge share of revenue as well. It's a tenth of Ericsson's.
Yeah, because it's such a massive market,
and it was only about 7% last. It's up 3 percentage points as a percentage of their overall revenues. You can see,
and a further indication of the size of the Chinese market is that Huawei grew last year in spite of everything.
Yeah, so Huawei with 90%. Well, it's not a 90% share, but Huawei and ZTE, I think, have 85
between them, 88%.
Yeah, so this is clearly why. Everybody looks at their results, Huawei's results, and goes, "Hang on a minute, aren't there all these sanctions? Aren't they getting banned?"
Yeah.
And it's their answers. Why are they still doing reasonably well? And it's clear why they're doing well when you've got a country that's building as many 5G base stations as the rest of the planet put together, and then some. So. It's clear why he's worried about what
totally
growth story is based on China, and unless they have that, the trouble is that they've got some other pressure points, Ericsson, at the moment. They've got this intellectual property issue, I think, with Samsung, which they've said could wipe out some profits in the next few quarters. They've got
in North America.
Yeah, they've got very, very slow growing markets in outside China. Pretty much all of them, I think. There's a bit of growth in North America. Europe not doing very well during the whole coronavirus pandemic. A lot of things have been delayed. So they need anything that's going to satisfy investors as a growth story is coming from China, really. And therefore this Swedish issue that's suddenly cropped up is big. It's big for them, and it's in a pretty difficult situation. But it just raises some. It does raise some awkward questions for him. And I think Huawei's already tried to get some capital out of this. This slightly sneaky fella in Australia, Jeremy, I can't even remember his surname now, but he's the head of corporate communications for Huawei Australia, was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald saying, hang on a minute, if Ericsson's so keen on fair play in Sweden, why don't they come over here and start lobbying a bit on our behalf?
Yeah.
Well, be interested exactly what I've got to say about that.
And look, I mean, I don't. We don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to understand what Etcom's vested interest is, and we can't begrudge him it. But I do agree with you. I mean, the point I made when I wrote it up is he's already made this point. A few months ago. I've got it up here. I can click through. He did an interview with the FT or something.
Yeah, it was. Originally
interview
was
the FT on 18th of November. So he's already done that. And this story was a leak to a Swedish paper about him apparently like texting or messaging a Swedish politician about it.
Well, that's worse, isn't it? Because
yes, exactly.
It's one thing saying it to the FT, but to actually be lobbying vigorously behind the scenes is like.
Yes, and to a politician, and the politician's public position is, well, I'm not. This isn't any of my business. This is with the authority. It's not for me to poke my nose in. So that doesn't reflect well on him. And in the fact that it leaked, I mean, Ericsson must have leaked it, as far as I'm concerned. From my understanding of how leaking works, very few leaks are a product of actual sort of signals intelligence, i.e. someone hacking it.
Yeah.
They're nearly, I'd say 90+% of leaks are controlled leaks, strategic leaks. And so, I don't have any proof of this. This is just my assumption. But Edcom's gone, why don't we leak this out? And through the press, we're basically signaling to the Chinese that we're still, we're still sort of fighting the good fight on this one. So please be nice to us.
Yeah.
And it just leaves a bad taste in the mouth.
It does, yeah. It's a bizarre situation to have, because I can't imagine there's a lot of love among Ericsson executives really for Huawei. We see all the accusations, none of which have been proven. Should point out they're all allegations, but this is a company over the years that has overtaken Ericsson in Europe to become the main mobile infrastructure player.
Yeah,
it's done it according to its harshest critics by massively undercutting these Western rivals on cost, using kind of Chinese government generosity to do that. And various other sort of unfair tactics dating back.
Because we know they get incredibly favorable credit terms off Chinese banks.
Exactly. Not to mention all the stuff about intellectual property infringement that dates back, to sort of the early years of the millennium when Cisco was involved in disputes with it. There must be a lot of, we know this because we go to trade fairs and we talk to these people, but we know there's not a lot of love for Huawei among Western vendors. And yet,
but that could just be pure resentment of their success.
I'm sure some of it is resentment. Yeah. She's got this.
But either way,
where he's sort of lobbying for Huawei. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's funny, and I've got some sympathy for him being in that awkward position.
Oh, totally.
What the other thing I speculate about is he could just shut up.
Yeah.
He could just say, well, at least he's not coming out and being triumphalist and going, "Ha, suck on that, Huawei." Yeah. He could just shut up. The fact that he doesn't shut up makes me wonder how much political pressure he's getting from China directly. And them going, "Oi, boy, you're being a bit quiet, mate. We've done you a favour. We haven't banned you from the country. How about you get involved?" That's what I wonder. And I wouldn't want to be in this position.
I wonder with with the Chinese position on this, and if you look at what China could do in response, how concerned are they? Perhaps. On the list of things that have happened to Huawei, being locked out of the Swedish market is probably not the worst thing of all, is it? They'd obviously be much more concerned about access to critical components and things that are going to the future of the business. A relatively small market like Sweden is not, it's not the end of the world if it's a market they can't access. And at the same time, I kind of think, well, they don't necessarily want to shut all competition out of their own market. The Chinese operators are state-owned and they're driven heavily to use Huawei and ZTE, but I think they like to have Western vendors in the mix just to kind of keep the local producers on their toes kind of thing.
Well, and also to counter the narrative that they're utterly protectionist.
As well as that. So I don't, you kind of wonder how much risk there is to Ericsson anyway. But like you say, maybe he's heard something, maybe somebody's lent on him. I always feel that if China is going to retaliate to, Western style sanctions and moves that are happening in Europe, they'll probably do it in maybe not even a telecom way at all, perhaps. Maybe they'll maybe look to other industries or other ways where they have a lot more muscle to kind of cause pain. And but
the only other awkward thing for Ekholm about the Swedish situation is the way in which they went about their ban in the first place. They seemed to do it in a way that left them quite legally exposed.
Yeah.
And Huawei, which presumably has some fairly sharp-suited lawyers sort of jumped on that almost straight away. So other people have gone, like the UK, we just went, yeah, security, and then we with the full ban, we went, yeah, more security because of this new thing. Whereas Sweden just seemed to make it conditional on this auction. I don't think anyone else has attached it to an auction in the way they did. I think they just left themselves more exposed to legal challenge than other places.
Maybe. I mean, I never really understand why a legal challenge has happened in this instance, and perhaps it's not in others like the UK, or France. But I remember looking at the Swedish statement and not the nitty gritty of it, but just the basic press release, and it was very undetailed, I guess. It almost literally just said, anybody who gets spectrum in this auction can't use Huawei. I think it was
end of.
As blunt as that. With no kind of justification, no sort of. Whereas you look at the UK, I remember we both went through all the UK stuff that came out of the NCSC when it first did, January this time last year, and it was all pages and pages of stuff about.
Yeah, they dotted the I's and crossed the T's.
Yeah. So I don't know, but maybe they just haven't been as thorough as they should. The Swedes, they've just we don't like Huawei, but.
All right. Well, since you mentioned the UK, that gives me a segue onto our next thing, which is talking about the UK's sort of fibre rollout.
Yeah.
Now, so we had back in, I think, June 2019, before Bojo was even Boris Johnson, that is, was even leader of the Conservative Party, let alone Prime Minister. He came up with this thing. I think Theresa May, the previous Prime Minister's target for full fibre rollout was 2033. And he went, well, that's nowhere near ambitious enough. How about 2025? Let's do that, yeah.
That's pretty good. It's better than your Cockney one.
That's just for Xi Jinping. Yes, a bit of British sinew will get the job done. Roll our sleeves up. And all these sort of silly things that he says. And at a time, I think Jamie covered a lot of them, and Jamie was fairly sort of cutting about it. It's just bollocks. He just pulled a date out of his arse.
Yeah.
And there was, when you actually looked at, if you extrapolated the curves of current rollout trends, it was clearly impossible to achieve unless there was a seismic change, the kind of inward investment the Chinese do, for example.
Yeah.
And then by last autumn, he went, all right, then we'll go for 85%. 85% gigabit capable. So there were all these sort of hedging terms.
Which in itself is a downgrade, isn't it? The gigabit capable is quite
different. Yes, as opposed to full fibre.
Which is future-proof.
FTTH or whatever.
Yeah.
And yes, well, when something's capable, it reminds me of some of those other hedging terms that you always get with broadband. I remember a few years ago, the advertising standards finally tried to stamp on all these broadband ads that said up to 40 megabits per second.
Yeah.
When, of course, what you'd actually get is 4 megabits per second. And you only get 40 if no one else in the whole world is on the internet and there was a prevailing wind and it wasn't raining.
You've nipped down to the local laboratory.
Yeah. and you sort of rubbed the cable coming into your house to get it nice and warm and ready. So, so that up to was clearly a really irritating marketing sleight of hand. And this gigabit capable sounds like a very sort of vague term. And anyway, and so, I'll announce it and I'll hand it over to you because I think you looked at this today. I think you said you're in the process of writing it up.
I'm sort of looking at it at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, so this, so I did write it up, but it's fairly short and sweet, as is my wont. This parliamentary committee, I think it was, I forget what committee it was. It's to do with.
It's the public
keeping an eye on shit. Public accounts. So
which looks at it's like a spending watchdog.
Well, you take it from there. What did they say?
Yeah, I mean, well, they've basically been quite critical, he's. I feel a bit of sympathy for Boris at the moment because it's not the easiest of times, obviously, for any government.
No.
And
would you want his job?
Would you want his job? We can be. I just get a bit sick of looking at Twitter, I think, and seeing anything he does, he picks his nose. He's done it in the wrong way. Nothing is right. And clearly there've been mistakes on the whole coronavirus strategy. But you can never please everybody. I mean, we're probably more sceptical of lockdown. I think.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
We'll come to that, but we've got our views about that, and you can't satisfy everyone. And
no.
on the broadband front, the PAC kind of came along and said that they were worried about a number of things. One is that this rural commitment is, they're kind of worried that rural areas might end up getting neglected actually, and end up with a lack of broadband alternatives. They say he's not removed some of the obstacles to fibre build out that were talked about, like high taxes and cumbersome planning regulations. And then they came out with this blanket statement that this promise of gigabit for all by 2025 has proven unachievable. As though this is some great realization they've just had the last few weeks.
No shit, Sherlock.
And it's all a bit stupid, I think. I mean, I remember when he wrote his article for the Telegraph announcing this sort of ambition to have gigabit everywhere by 2025. And Jamie, who's not with us anymore, but as you say, covered this quite a lot. And I were at a broadband.
Do you know, it cracks me up. Sorry to butt in.
Yeah, go on.
It's funny how people say not with us anymore when someone leaves a company.
Oh, that sounds bad. All right, so he's at Vodafone, yeah. But yeah, Jamie, who's now at Vodafone,
us, just not with us.
Yeah, we're writing about. We were actually at a broadband conference in London with quite a few sort of prominent speakers and stakeholders, people like Clive Selley, CEO of Openreach. And we were going around and asking people's opinion on this. And people didn't really want to go on the record saying it because they suspected he's going to come in and be prime minister and you don't want to laugh at his ideas. But nobody really took it very seriously. No one ever in the industry thought we were going to have gigabit for everybody by 2025.
Exactly.
At the same time, I think the point that a lot of people made to me was that there's nothing wrong with aiming high. Yeah? If you have something like a really lofty ambition and maybe you get to 60% or 70% by that date, then that's not a bad achievement. I mean, you've got to remember the UK is massively behind some of the leading European nations.
Like Spain, for example.
Yeah. Now, I looked at the stats just before I started writing my article, and when Boris Johnson came in, full fibre networks, so stuff that goes right up to the doorway or whatever, the building, were available to about 8%, I think, of UK homes, which is pretty bad. We were right at the bottom of rankings, and we were, you look at these FTTH Council Europe presentations, they were always like, we're a laggard, we're not improving. At the moment, it's 18%. So that's an increase of 10%
more than double
in 18 months, including 10 months of a pandemic, right?
Yeah.
BT Openreach is on course to hit 4.5 million premises by March this year. I spoke to them this week, actually. I spoke to Peter Bell, who's the CTO, and asked him what the figure is at the moment, 4 million. So they're completely on track. They're likely to get all the pricing certainty that they've asked for, which is controversial a little bit. I know, that opens up questions about fair competition, but they've always said they want that for this commitment to deliver broadband to 20 million homes by the mid-2020s. Now, if they did that, that's 70% of homes covered with gigabit broadband. And the infrastructure market is more competitive than it's ever been. You've got Virgin Media investing, you've got City Fibre with big ambitions for the mid-2020s as well, not to mention all these smaller companies like Hyperoptic, GigaClear. So
and Vodafone.
Vodafone. Now, at the same time, so I don't think there's anything wrong with this, with what's happening actually in the UK's broadband sector. And the other thing you've got to consider is that you can build this stuff out, but are people actually going to use it? Do people want it anyway? It's all very well saying we need to have gigabit everywhere. You look at BT's results for last September, and Openreach was showing about 3.5 million homes covered at that stage. Only 655,000 of those lines are actually being used in September. So a lot of people just don't see a need for, and it's not because it's not that affordable. It's only a little bit more. All these prices are very, very.
That's still odd, though. That's still odd that what we're saying, like a fifth or a sixth of those people who can actually take it.
Yeah, the take-up rate is not very
weird.
And I mean, there might be all sorts of reasons for that. A home pass is not the same necessarily as a home connected. There might be some service issues. There might be, maybe it is just that people don't want to spend the extra few pounds. But whatever it is, if there was real pent-up demand and an urgent need, gigabit speed service. Now, this is the thing I have an issue with. There seems to be this obsession with gigabit for all, just for its sake. Like, why do we want to have gigabit for all? And why are we spending money to subsidise gigabit rollout, which is what this plan's all about. There's quite a big chunk of public sector money, I think about 5 billion, that's been assigned for...
Like we've got lots of spare cash to chuck around.
Exactly. At a time like now, that's been assigned for hard-to-reach areas. Why do hard-to-reach areas need a gigabit speed connection? I'm working at home at the moment. I mean, I make the point that in Slovakia, which is where my wife's from, and we went there for the Christmas period, I filed a couple of... This is up in the Tatras Mountains out in the middle of nowhere. I had no fixed line connection at all.
Tatras Mountains?
Tatras Mountains.
Oh, just imagining
part of the Carpathian mountain range, actually. It's part of the Carpathian mountain range, which Dracula made famous, of course.
Ah, excellent.
But up in the middle of nowhere, with not a decent fixed line broadband connection, I was able to check news stories, upload things that I was writing to the content management system, and send emails over by tethering 4G to my laptop. You don't need a gigabit speed connection to order food on Ocado. Why are we subsidising rich cottage owners in the countryside? Netflix on high definition. You know, I don't get this obsession with having a gigabit speed connection for everybody. And I think if
I completely agree.
Go on.
So while you were talking, I did a speed test using the Ookla speed test on what I've got, and I'm using EE broadband, and I got download of 34.25 megabits per second.
Yeah, which is way off gigabit, and you can probably
just a bit.
Yeah. So
and
we're on a Zoom call now.
Yeah, I can do most of the stuff I want to do. We're on the Zoom call. There isn't buffering.
No, so why do we want to spend 5 billion on providing Peak District, rich owners with gigabit speed connections so they can sit at home and watch Netflix? Because what else are they going to do with it?
Wouldn't it be better to spend that money on some like fixed wireless access or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the main thing the government can do in this area is actually just keep out of the way. I mean, the Ofcom's figures at the moment for superfast, now superfast to them means 30 megabits per second, and I'm not sure how.
I've got superfast then.
Superfast, but I think they're overestimating this a bit, and I'm not sure all these services will be that reliable. But they're saying about 96% of UK homes now have superfast services, which includes things like 4G. Yeah. Because in some areas you might be able to get quite a high speed connection on your 4G phone. So, but that's a huge amount of premises that are covered for basic needs that you would need during a pandemic. Being able to work from home, being able to get your children online for education, being able to order pizza and groceries. There's some need for. I'm not saying there's no need for public subsidy to serve some of these communities with a basic broadband connection. But I don't see the need to spend billions on gigabit. And I think the best...
Exactly. No, I think we agree. You could divert that money onto something that if 95% of the country has already got acceptable broadband, spend the money on getting fixed wireless access or something else that's viable to the remaining 5%. And then you hit your 100% and everyone can shut up.
Yeah, and focus your energy actually on where I think the Public Accounts Committee probably got it right is that there needs to be more to do. Because this is something you hear the operators say quite a lot as well, actually, is fibre taxes, and planning regulations and getting landowner permissions for things and trying to get things rolled out here. All of that's a real nightmare. If you talk to anybody who's involved in this stuff at Openreach or, the other company, they all complain about that issue. That's the thing they all get upset about. It's the funding side of it. Make the regulatory environment really sort of smooth and this permission process as smooth as possible and get out of the way. And let the private sector do what it's shown it can do, because it's actually done a bloody good job over the last...
Well, okay, so I completely agree with you. And we also know why they don't get out of the way, because for some reason this has become politicised. And we've got... And one of the main reasons it's become politicised is because of Bojo deciding to jump on the bandwagon.
Yeah, and it was a rookie error to do that, actually.
It was. And now it's, as I put in my piece, a millstone around his neck.
Because what happened was, I suspect he's sitting at home one day, has an outage or something, and he's looking at the pizza wheel of doom, as he put it, or whatever, and not able to do it. And he thought, hang on a minute, Spain's got 96% fibre because he'd read some articles.
Let's get on it. David Cameron did that a few years ago. He couldn't check the footy scores while he's in Norfolk.
Exactly.
So he made it a thing. It's like, is this how you make policy?
I know, and you could sense that when he wrote that article, he was a bit miffed that he'd had a bad broadband day, and he's gone and sort of dug this situation for him. When in actual fact, we're way behind Spain and Portugal, no doubt, but that's nothing to do with Boris Johnson. That's a legacy of things that have happened long before he came to power. And the improvement that's happened while he's been in power, and we've had a pandemic on for 10 months, has been massive.
Yeah.
Go from 8% to 18% of full fibre,
Can I say one other quick thing about the politicisation of this stuff? This week, so we've had this lockdown. In fact, once we've done this, it might lead us on to a sort of more general current affairsy stuff. We had this lockdown 3, which I'm saying is I'm characterising.
Is it 3? I thought it was 2.
No, we had the first main one, and then we had about a 2 to 4 week one, I think, in November. It was one of those sort of circuit breakers.
Oh, and then we never came out of it really anyway.
Which broke no fucking circuits at all. So it's lockdown 3. I'm calling it Clubber Lang. I've decided these lockdowns are now basically Rocky sequels. So we've had the 2 Apollo Creed lockdowns. This is Clubber Lang. We'll have Ivan Drago sometime in the spring.
Yeah.
And a fascinating thing about being a journalist is just watching how narratives develop and how journalistic consensus develops. Because what few journalists are left tend to be real pack hunters. They see one angle and everyone else jumps on it. They're all quite opportunistic. And I don't necessarily blame them for it. There's a lot of journalists who are being asked to turn out a lot of stories and they just don't have time to do their own original research. So it's not just the journalist's fault, it's the whole industry. But and so this week, actually, it was catalysed by a bit of opportunism by Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, the opposition, going, we got this lockdown, but loads of kids still can't access laptops, so they can't do remote learning. And I thought, and he goes, and then, so he put pressure on mobile operators to make mobile data free. And I thought 2 things about it. Firstly, I was sceptical about how many people can't get onto the internet at all. There's some Ofcom data flying around. Some people quote some pretty big numbers, like 10% of the population, but the Ofcom data I've seen is less than that. Still higher than I thought, actually. I'm still surprised how many people don't have an internet connection. I just thought, Jesus Christ, it just seems impossible in this day
especially
and age.
Now. Yeah, last year I was. Yeah. Before that, maybe not. But
you would have thought. Anyway, the data's flying around. There are some. So I'll concede that. I doubt it's loads. But I also thought, why is he going on about mobile data? Surely the most important thing to do, especially when you're locked down, is just to have a broadband connection. So what we should be addressing is those people who, for whatever reason, don't even have 20 quid a month or whatever, or possibly even less to drop on entry-level broadband. But, I'd be surprised. They must have, they'll have a TV, and most TVs are internet connected. Anyway, who knows? I don't know the hard data. But I just thought he was a bit misguided in that way. But I was clearly in a minority because everyone's jumped on that and just gone, think of these poor kids who can't just learn. And don't get me wrong, any kids who are locked down at home and can't do distance learning definitely need help. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. So I thought that was an interesting further politicisation of telecoms. And then, one other little dig, I got to say, I already put it in a piece. So a few operators stepped up to the plate. So Starmer said this thing, Guardian jumped on it. Everyone else went, yeah, what are you going to do, you greedy bastard mobile operators not caring about poor children? So, of course, the mobile operators went, oh, shit, and immediately started offering all this stuff. And there's a sort of government scheme that helps them identify which kids need extra help. And that's good. I'm pleased they did all that. But then they all issued press releases about it. Now, my issue, again, as a journalist, I'm skeptical about companies ever acting in a moral way at all, ever.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's possible for people within the company, even the CEO, to have a strong moral conscience. But the company on the whole, as a corporate entity, doesn't have a moral compass. It's there if it's a public company to serve its shareholders, if it's a private company to seek growth, whatever.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And, and we get CSR, corporate social responsibility, but that's a box-ticking exercise so that they can say that they're good and, and they can wave rainbow flags every now and then and hug a few trees and tick all these boxes.
Yeah, and there's been a lot going on recently as well.
Yes, and it will just keep going because they're all shit scared of Twitter. and being called out by a few activists on Twitter. It's ridiculous how held to ransom so many people are by a few sort of vocal activist types. And so when they issue a press release going, look how nice we've been, look how altruistic we've been, it's like, well, really being altruistic, you wouldn't issue a press release about it, would you?
Yeah.
You'd just get on with it. You wouldn't then seek to gain reputational capital on the back of it. So that's just my little dig there, and it's probably unpopular. And most people are like, Scott, why can't you just accept it? Good things happen and not look the gift horse in the mouth. But it's kind of my job, isn't it?
No, companies don't do good things, as you say. They only do things that ultimately are in their own interests. So, might have good repercussions. But
if good things come of it and it's a win-win, then great. But what I'm not going to do is treat him like some kind of philanthropist organisation. That's all.
Yeah.
So I think we've been talking quite a while. So we'll have our sort of final sweep up of what's been going on in the world. So touching on what we were just covering with that final segment, the whole lockdown thing. So I know you and I, again, we seem to be going against popular consensus, and that we're quite skeptical about the need for these continuing lockdowns. Now, my point of view is, I think it's clear that this is probably, I've got some mates whose Christmas were ruined by coronavirus, and the data definitely seems to be going in the wrong direction. And so it's clear, I'm not going to belittle it. I think I got criticised for referring to it as a cold, and I think I'll, while I was being hyperbolic, I'll concede that that's probably a bit of hyperbole too far, because it's clearly much more severe than a cold. But I still think that locking down the whole country is wrong on two primary levels. First level is that this overwhelmingly affects over 70s. So lock down the over 70s. And we can come into this, and Pierre, I don't know if he's still listening, but we were arguing the toss with Pierre on this, and he sees a different view on that. And then the second thing is just the complete lack of discussion about the pros and cons of locking down, i.e. the collateral damage that's done by locking down. So, I'll finish it there. Is that kind of how you view all this?
Yeah, I'm like you. I don't want to belittle the illness itself, and I appreciate that we've now got this variant that's much more transmissible, and and I take the point about how risky that can be for some groups. And the thing for me is that the real thing that the government's worried about and needs to do is to make sure that the NHS is able to cope with this.
That was always it back in the first lockdown, wasn't it? Flatten the curve and all that. But
there's nothing in the data, that I've looked at to suggest that, other than it being more transmissible, it's any more of a risk to most people than it was, the first time round. If you look at the comments that Whitty is his name, is it Professor Whitty has come out with? He seems to think at the moment that about 2% of the English population or British population or whatever has coronavirus. And you look at hospitalizations, I think there's only about 30,000 people in hospital now. As an actual number, that's high. I know that's enough to put a lot of pressure on the NHS, but as a percentage of people who've got the disease, if he's right with his estimate, it's only about 2.5%.
So most people just sweat it out at home, like when they get the flu.
It seems that way. I'm surprised because this is what I don't understand. I seem to remember last year being told that this is quite a serious illness. Now, by serious illness, I thought, well, that must mean serious illness means you have to go to hospital to be looked at.
You can't breathe.
Well, if it's a fifth of people, then why have we only got 30,000 people in hospital and 2% of the population's got it? And the other thing is, you look at the ONS data for fatalities, which I think is sort of reflective of hospitalizations as well to some extent. But the week before Christmas, which is the last one I looked at, it's not even over 70s. 63% of fatalities are people aged over 80. So, all you'd have to do to take pressure off the NHS is actually ask people who are over the age of 80 to do what they've already asked people who are in vulnerable groups to do anyway, and shield. And now I know there's one view that if we're asking, 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds to shield, then it's not fair that we allow other people to go out and go about their merry ways. But I'm not really sure I get the logic of that.
No, nor do I.
You've already asked vulnerable groups to shield for one thing. So you've already set a precedent for treating one section of the population differently from the rest. And it's in the interests of everybody for us to try and get back to normal and to keep the economy going. It's not going to help any year-olds and 90-year-olds if we face some kind of economic collapse in the future. Yeah. So
totally. And the only nuance to that. So we've had colleagues and Pierre's not speaking up, so I'm gonna characterize his argument. Here we are. He's just unmiked himself. Pierre, what was your pushback on the on what or Ian was just talking about that we were chatting about earlier in the week?
No, I mean, at the beginning I was like, I hear a lot of complaining, but I don't hear any solutions offered. And then you said to basically lock up all the over 70s. And
over 80s, yes, I think would be. You wouldn't need to do over 70s, actually, I don't think.
In a perfect world or totalitarian world, yes, do that. That would be great. And you said, why can't we ask them? We did ask, and asking doesn't do anything. Asking them, there's still going to be loads of them who are like, thanks, but no thanks. Especially when they're that old. They don't. I mean, most of the people who think this is a conspiracy, I bet they're old, actually. I don't think young people think it's a conspiracy. And so my point in the chat that we had 2 days ago was sadly, the only choice is to close down all places for people to go. So they have no options but to stay at home because there's nowhere to go. And
so my thoughts on you saying that, Pierre, certainly the way it's been presented has been the fact that places are locked down is a byproduct of people not being able to leave the house. Locking down places to keep people from temptation hasn't been the primary method. And in this lockdown, that you can still go to the supermarket and all that sort of thing. But back to your point about it being totalitarian to sort of force them to stay in. Well, they're kind of doing that to everyone. So that's where I push back on that thing.
Indirectly, though. It's indirect.
Well, it's not that indirect because I mean there was a story that I put up on Facebook which I noticed Scott saw just before we came on about two poor 20-year-old women in Derbyshire. The Derbyshire police seem to be absolutely awful.
Right, yeah.
They've obviously been reading their Gestapo handbooks Christmas, but these were the arseholes who were sending drones up during the first lockdown around the Peak
District dog walkers
and filming dog walkers and putting their pictures up on social media. And these two women had apparently driven 5 miles down the road from where they lived to go for a walk in around a lake or something, and taken a cup of coffee with them in a kind of flask. And there were police waiting there for them. And then they got out of the car, and the police were like, "What are you doing? We're going to fine you. You've broken restrictions. 5 miles is not local, and what you're carrying counts as a picnic." I mean, that's pretty draconian. And if they're doing things like that to the entire population anyway, then Scott's point's right, isn't it? We all kind of face that sort of reality, unfortunately, anyway at the moment.
But there's a fact is that when we did it the first time, like the real one, last year, it worked. It did go down. Then we tried other methods, and it didn't.
Well, it worked in terms of driving it down, but it didn't work in terms of not hammering businesses, of not having an impact on children's education, of not delaying,
of course, yeah.
Of not causing mental health problems, of not, all these other things which we haven't even seen the beginning of yet. Because you miss 1 million breast cancer screenings in 1 year, 3 years' time, you're going to have a big spike in fatalities in that area. I'm sure you will.
Yeah, but if we let this thing, if we open, then the hospitals will be run over anyway, so they won't be able to do anything else anyway, right?
But that's why that's the one thing they need to do is to prevent the hospitals from being overrun, which is why I think you target, the hospital pressure could be addressed immediately by just trying to address vulnerable groups, which they've already done anyway. They've asked the vulnerable groups to shield. Ask the 80 and 90-year-olds to shield as well.
Yeah, and again, my point is asking is not going to do anything, sadly.
Okay, well, let's sort of wrap it up. But I mean, I think that's indicative of some of the discussions we're having. And what I think's interesting about it all, and I think we've all been good boys. Like I'm on quarantine because I got back from the Canary Islands, and we're all being good. The whole family's staying in, but it does yield, I think, really interesting conversations such as this one as to what the limits of state interference in individuals' life should be and what should precipitate it. Obviously, we've decided that this is a big enough deal that we're going to curtail civil liberties to an extent that I don't think has happened since the Second World War. And I've had conversations with people where they go, well, yeah, it's that severe that we got to do it. But I also think it's perfectly valid to push back and go, well, I think it's an overreaction. But the funny thing is how upset some people get when you just push back a little bit on the consensus.
Well, I think that's typical of what we were talking about earlier with polarization of opinion these days, and you're either one thing or the other. And just as with Brexit, I find this issue is quite similar. You look at social media, and if you suggest to some people for 1 minute that you ease restrictions, they're like, "Oh, you're a murderer. You don't care about people's lives," and they can't bring themselves to see the other side of the argument at all. And it's clear that locking down now will cost lives in the future. You just don't see the deaths at the moment, but they can't bring themselves to see that because they're so wedded to their opinion.
No, my point is that it is.
I'm not Pierre. I'm not putting you in. I'm not putting you in that category, Pierre. By the way.
No. I know. I'm just because I was thinking as you were talking, like it is an overreaction, but to me it's sadly it's an overreaction that's brought on because of the lowest common denominator. I mean, I know, Scott, you think it's wrong to think of the people as dumb, but
yes. I mean, I'm not a big fan of that anyway. And there's sort of certain Guardianista types and I'm not saying you are one, who seem to constantly view the world as us enlightened few versus the sort of ill-educated rabble. And I'm not a big fan of people who have that point of view. But it's just a much simpler thing about individual liberty for me. At what stage is it all right for the collective to impose its will on the individual? These are the sorts of conversations they should be having more in the States. I think we're running out of time, so we won't get into the US stuff, which is probably just as well, as I've already had indications from certain US people I know that you can't state an opinion on that without everyone having a little palpitation. But this is what the US has founded on. It's supposed to be about liberty. That's slipping back in that way. And I'm just getting the impression in these unnuanced times, the prevailing narrative seems to favor control of the individual rather than letting individuals make decisions of their own. And back to your point about the old people, Pierre, if an 80-year-old wants to go out and risk their life, why shouldn't they?
Yeah, but then once they get sick,
that's the problem. I suppose.
You have to stay home now. You made your choice. No, they'll still go to the hospital and take a bed space.
Right. So then we get the point where we mandate people's behaviour in order to not be a burden on the NHS. And then you're going to start saying people can't be fat, and then I'll really start pushing back.
No, it's like they should make people sign. If you can go outside, do anything you want, but we're going to somehow tag you. Then you'll be refused to be treated for coronavirus. You could be accepted for anything else, but not for coronavirus. It's a slippery
slope as well, mate. But then you get into health passports and stuff.
Totalitarian again.
I mean, the UK has tried to be more, to remain more libertarian, I suppose, about a lot of this than other European countries have, hasn't it? And I know from going to, Slovakia over the Christmas period that some of the restrictions there are things that we haven't introduced here. We haven't gone quite as far. Wearing face masks outdoors all the time, for instance, is something people seem to be doing there. And I know from relatives in France that it's that they've gone much further in terms of saying what you can and can't do and trying to police it in quite an aggressive way. You've got to have a piece of paper each day that says you go into the shops. You can't just go outdoors to wander around the block without the risk that some officer comes along and finds you. So,
but the result is that there's way less cases, and the country is not as locked down as us at all. Actually, in France, you can still go outside.
But it has been in the past, hasn't it? Whenever they have a lockdown, they're much more sort of draconian about it than we ever in the UK. And it's not just France. I think they have been in Italy and Spain as well. When they've imposed restrictions, they've really kind of gone to the limit with it in terms of
Italy. Italy, you couldn't be outside. It's crazy.
Yeah.
You've got to wear a mask outside in Spain.
Yeah.
It's just weird. It's annoying. It was annoying while I was on holiday to have to wear a mask while I'm walking down the street when I'm nowhere near anyone.
Same in Slovakia. Yeah.
But
but
the
anyway.
annoying thing is that there's no. I mean, I feel there's no clear cut. You know, I don't have an answer to make it better. You know, there's no clear.
No, well, the
we should
problem
do
is
A,
that,
B, and C, and it will all be better. I don't think.
well, the problem is that
exists right
public
now.
policy. People forget this. Public policy in the UK has been what they call suppression until there's a full vaccine program. That's been public policy for a while. So it's been inevitable that we're going to have a sequence of lockdowns until there's a vaccine rollout. And that's fine. You know, you could argue that we're at the beginning of the end there. But two things concern me about that stipulation. What is the vaccine threshold after which everyone's going to be allowed to get on with their lives? Is it just 90% of over 70s, or is it 60% of the entire population, including children, or what? And then the second thing is the prospect of things like health passports, whereby you will have civil liberties curtailed in perpetuity unless you can prove that you yourself have been vaccinated. Those
which Spain has already said it's
concerns.
going to issue. Yeah, Spain has already announced plans for a health passport, but of course we're not going to use them. We just want to issue them, or some ridiculous.
Yeah, we just want to know, but
we just want to know. But don't worry. I mean, it's worrying. I mean, I think on the first point, I think I don't know for certain because it hasn't happened and the government's plans change all the time. But I'm pretty sure Johnson was saying recently that he hopes by the time we get everybody over 70 and vulnerable groups vaccinated, and the aim sort of mid-February, I think, but probably more likely early March. And even then it could slip. But once that's done, then he was saying we should see easing of restrictions. But I don't know what easing of restrictions mean. I mean, I personally think if you get to the point where everybody over 70 and anybody who's in a vulnerable group is vaccinated, I don't see why you'd have to have any.
What's the problem?
At all, to be quite honest with you, because
me too.
Talking about a caseload, you look at deaths again. Going back to Ernest's stats, deaths under 50 in the week up to Christmas, when there was 3,000, I think, deaths. There were 40 of people under 50. You know, it's horrible, obviously, for people who are in that situation. And I suspect a lot of them probably have underlying health conditions. So hopefully those would be people that would be vaccinated as well, and the numbers would be even smaller. But we can't just shut down a country because a small number of people are suffering, adverse conditions from a virus. I mean, it sets a weird precedent, I think, for how you tackle future viruses. You know, like a bad flu season can kill 20,000 people. Do we say that's too much to contemplate in the future? We have to have similar restrictions.
Indeed. So there's lots of
questions about how we treat things. Yeah. But I would hope certainly that once we have everybody over 70 and vulnerable groups, I don't see why there should be any restrictions at all at that point, to be quite honest.
Yes, I agree. Okay. Unless you've got any last stuff you want to say, Pierre, we should probably wrap it up there. I think we're well over an hour.
No, I just think I have kind of high hopes for, this once spring starts coming, there'll be the season, which will help a little bit, the sun and being outdoor.
Yeah. Well, it certainly did last year.
Yeah,
those two things together, hopefully,
Yeah.
Yeah, so then we'll see. But don't forget, even last summer, there were still some restrictions. And so, it'll be interesting to see.
It seems like they weren't.
It seemed like they weren't, yeah. It did seem like they weren't, yeah.
Well, compared to now, but not compared to 2 years ago.
I forgot what these were, yeah.
Well,
I think we had no concerts and no stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd take going into a pub. I'd happily go into with a face mask and not complain about having to wear one at the moment.
I know. So whereas 2 years ago, if someone told you to wear a face mask, you would have told them to shove it up their arse.
Yeah.
So,
which is the correct place to put it.
Let's see. I've seen other people write analytical stuff. Yes, he's a good place to end it. Saying that we won't be back to normal till 2022. So there's a cheery note to end it on this cold January stuck in the house. But anyway, we're still cheerful. Look at us smiling. Bless us. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks a lot, guys. And expect this format for the foreseeable future, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.
And there we
go.
Cool.